So El is the much older religion. El is the heavenly father. He's the father of all the gods. He's the father of Baal. He's the father of Chemosh and all these other gods, and presumably the father of Yahweh as well. That religion did in fact have child sacrifice as an historical reality, and we get evidence for it from Greek and Roman writings. Now, again, people will criticize this because the Greeks and Romans both hated the Phoenicians. They fought wars with the Phoenicians, so they're not, going out of their way to praise the Phoenicians. In fact, they're writing their own sets of propaganda in hatred of the Phoenicians. Nonetheless, they're writing stories that track the Bible stories very closely in terms of how they describe the child sacrifice. So my argument is that El, and by extension Baal, because in the places where Baal is the king of the gods for El, those are the people that historically did these quite gruesome child sacrifices. They didn't just kill their babies. It was fairly dramatic about how they did it, and we'll get into those details. And that the Yahweh cult, as they come along, they I don't know if they were a reform cult from the beginning, but they'd certainly become a reform cult in time. Now they tell us that the biblical writers tell us that Moses lays down the law right from the start, because Moses is the one who introduces Yahweh. All the scholars agree with this. Even Christian scholars agree with this. And I'll talk about this in my slides. Yahweh enters the scene with the Exodus. They didn't know Yahweh before that. And so was he a reform cult right from the start? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. But in time, he definitely becomes a reform cult. And they want to shut down the worship of Asherah and the mother goddesses. Separate conversation for another day. And they want to shut down the religion of Baal. And so that begs the question, why? Why do they want to shut it down? What's wrong with Baal?
This is Brave New History. Thank you for watching. And we're here with Edward Dodge, our friend. Let's see, we've done a few interviews on the goddess, on matriarchy, and we'll talk about here the dispute between the cult of El and the cult of Baal. So thank you so much for coming.
Hey, Elliot, it's always great to be here, and I appreciate you having me. And so what I really wanted to get into today is the idea that of First Temple polytheism and what was going on in the First Temple among these pagan Israelites, and specifically the idea that El and Yahweh were still separate gods. And scholars have long recognized that there are two separate gods in the Bible, that when you see the word God and the words the Lord in the Bible, these translate back to Elohim or El on the side of God, and that Yahweh and that the Lord translates back to Yahweh, and that initially these were entirely separate gods, and that their identities don't get merged till later on. Now, among the scholars, it's not, I don't think there's any consensus per se about when that merging comes. I'm of the opinion it happens after the exile, after the First Temple is destroyed and they're in Babylon, and that the entire First Temple period, so meaning the entire history of the historical Israel and Judah, so that entire actual history when those countries existed, they were polytheistic, they were pagans. They were never monotheists. They didn't even have a concept of monotheism. If we went back in time to visit the historical King Solomon's temple, not only would we find that it was never draped in gold and riches, but that we wouldn't even recognize what they were doing. They didn't have a Torah. They weren't Jews. They didn't call themselves Jews. And they weren't even remotely monotheistic. They were totally polytheistic culture. They've got goddesses. They've got Asherah as their mother goddess. King Solomon's worshiping Astarte, who's the queen of heaven for the Canaanites. And basically they're worshiping the Canaanite gods. They are Canaanites. and they are a set of Canaanites. They are a subset of Canaanites, but like America has a lot of different subcultures. We're all Americans, white Americans, black Americans, Hispanic Americans, etc. We're all Americans, but a lot of different subcultures in America. And I think something along those lines is happening in ancient Canaan. And the Israelites are a subset of Canaanites. Now, in the Jerusalem temple, in Judah and Israel, two separate countries. So in Judah is where Jerusalem is. That's where you find Yahweh, and that's where you find the cult of Yahweh. Now, El was the heavenly father, the father of the gods, worshipped across all the Canaanite cultures. So you've got these different patron deities in different parts of the country. So you've got the Moabites worship Chemosh, and Milcom is another god, and then Baal was the big time king of the gods for the Canaanites. He is the Zeus for the Canaanites. And the Greeks even describe Baal as Zeus, because we have a lot of Greek literature, which we'll get into, talking about the Canaanites, talking about the Phoenicians in particular. So the Phoenicians were the branch of Canaanites that are coming out of Lebanon. That's the cities of Tyre and Sidon and Byblos that are all mentioned in the Bible. And they were very wealthy and very important. And they were the first people to routinely sail around the Mediterranean and colonize all of the Mediterranean. And so prior to the Greeks and Romans, the Phoenicians were the wealthiest, most sophisticated people in the Mediterranean. And so during the Old Testament period, which is roughly 1000 BC, is when King David would have supposedly taken Jerusalem. We know they took Jerusalem, and assuming King David's a historical figure, he took Jerusalem in the year, it's like around 1004 or 1006 BC, right around 1000 BC. I take that to be a historical event. That's a separate debate for another day as to whether it's, we know that they took Jerusalem though. Whether or not King David was a historical person, we know they took Jerusalem, and they did it around the year 1000. And so then they set up the nations of Israel and Judah. Whether there was a united kingdom or not, again, a separate debate. We know there was the two countries, and that the Assyrians destroyed Israel in 722, I want to say, and then the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in 586. And we know those are historical events because we've got the Assyrian records talking about it. So we know that history actually happened. My argument is that entire time they are totally polytheistic. And then there's a fight between, in the Bible, it makes it very clear, there's a fight between the Yahwists, being the followers of Yahweh, and the Baalists, the followers of Baal. And they make a big deal about this. They're fighting about this stuff a lot throughout this entire portion of the Bible. You've got multiple times where they smash the altars of Baal or burn down the temples of Baal. You got the big fight between the Yahwists and the Baalists with Elijah on the battle on Mount Carmel during the time of Jezebel and Ahab. Again, historical people in the 9th century, in the 850s BC. That would have been around 850 BC, 840 BC, something like that. Jezebel and Ahab are most definitely historical people because, again, we've got records about them. Is Elijah a historical person? I mean, there was followers of Yahweh. I'm not going to tell you there was not an historical Elijah. But at any rate, the Bible makes it very clear there's this huge dispute between Yahweh and Baal. And they talk a lot about child sacrifice. So the question is, and there's a lot of debate about this, a lot of scholarly debate, as to whether there was actually child sacrifice. Now, the Hebrew prophets in the Bible go on at great length to criticize the practice of child sacrifice. They talk about different kings who were very, very bad, like Ahaz and Manasseh, who were very, very bad because they burned their children in fire. And the prophet Jeremiah, who's there at the end, he's there. He's a witness to the destruction of Babylon in 586, and he goes with the exiles. He goes on at great length about how the sinners, the sinful Israelites, were building these Tophets and burning their children in fire and sacrificing their children and saying, saying Yahweh, and he's speaking for Yahweh, saying, and the thought never crossed my mind to order this. So then, and I'm going to get into all this. I've got slides here. Mm-hmm. The story of Abraham and Isaac. This is, again, one of the most famous stories in the Bible. People talk about it a lot. God orders Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, And Abraham goes and is getting ready to do it. He faithfully complies. And then at the last second, Yahweh comes along and says, you don't have to do it. Here's a substitute ram. And you've proven your love and fealty of God. So now you don't actually have to sacrifice your beloved son. And so many non-Christians are very quick to be critical of this story and say, how could you worship such a horrible, awful God that would require you to do such a horrible thing? And then people debate, could this really have happened or not? So my argument is, and I'm going to get into some evidence here, is that the religion of El. So El is the much older religion. El is the Heavenly Father. He's the father of all the gods. He's the father of Baal. He's the father of Chemosh and all these other gods. And presumably the father of Yahweh as well. That religion did in fact have child sacrifice as an historical reality. And we get evidence for it from Greek and Roman writings. Now, again, people will criticize this because the Greeks and Romans both hated the Phoenicians. They fought wars with the Phoenicians. So they're not, going out of their way to praise the Phoenicians. In fact, they're writing their own sets of propaganda in hatred of the Phoenicians. Nonetheless, they're writing stories that track the Bible stories very closely in terms of how they describe the child sacrifice. So my argument is that El, and by extension Baal, because in the places where Baal is the king of the gods for El, those are the people that historically did these quite gruesome child sacrifices. They didn't just kill their babies. It was fairly dramatic about how they did it. And we'll get into those details. And that the Yahweh cult, as they come along, they, I don't know if they were a reform cult from the beginning, but they'd certainly become a reform cult in time. Now they tell us that the biblical writers tell us that Moses lays down the law right from the start, because Moses is the one who introduces Yahweh. All the scholars agree with this. Even Christian scholars agree with this. And I'll talk about this in my slides. Yahweh enters the scene with the Exodus. They didn't know Yahweh before that. And so was he a reform cult right from the start? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. But in time, he definitely becomes a reform cult. And they want to shut down the worship of Asherah and the mother goddesses. Separate conversation for another day. And they want to shut down the religion of Baal. And so that begs the question, why? Why do they want to shut it down? What's wrong with Baal? Well, I'm of the opinion that cultural practices come long before any kind of esoteric theology and philosophy, that there's a very real fight about cultural stuff, and that the philosophy comes along later on as a justification for a cultural fight. And you can see a modern day parallel in the fights over slavery and racism in America. When we fought, because I don't think people are going to spill blood over philosophy. People spill blood over practical stuff. They spill blood over money and power and things people are doing. So in America was our Civil War. Some people would say the Civil War was a fight over the political philosophy of states' rights versus, a strong government. Not really. It was a fight over slavery. The reason the aspect of states' rights only was a function of, it only matters because states' rights was going to be applied to defend slavery. So states' rights was this legal philosophy to use to defend and create the legal framework for slavery. The fight over the Civil War, which was very bloody, was a fight over slavery. I think only an apologist for the Confederacy is going to make it out to be a fight over, political philosophy. I'm pretty sure they didn't attack Fort Sumter over political philosophy. So that's my parallel. And you have any questions before we get started? I can jump into the slides.
Yeah. So are we saying that El and Baal are the same figure?
No, Baal is the king of the gods. El is the father of all the gods.
Okay, so there's a king and the father.
Yeah. The father of the gods is not the active. El is distant and out in space. He is forming the cosmos. He's not dealing with little old people down here on Earth. Baal is his son who rules with the authority of his father. And Baal is the storm god. So when it rains, that's Baal. And the dew is Baal. Baal is this god of water and rain and storms and lightning and thunder. He's just like Zeus. I'll get to this in the slides. The Greeks who are talking about these guys, They equate El with Kronos. Kronos is the father of all the Olympian gods in the Greek traditions, and the Greek traditions, the Olympians have to overthrow Kronos so that Zeus can rule. It's similar but slightly different, but the formulation is the same, is that it's a father and son. And we see this all over Near Eastern traditions. For the Sumerians, An is the equivalent of El. He's the heavenly father, and his son Enlil rules as the king of the gods. And then for the Babylonians, it was Anu. They changed his name to Anu, and his son Marduk rules as the active king of the gods. Because the heavenly father, he's out in space. He's distant and far away. He's not accessible to us little old human beings. It's the lower gods that are closer to us and who are the actual gods of like nature and stuff. El is special. El is primordial, and he's big, and like he's far away. I mean, that's just the way I see it. Like he's like, the god of the heaven. He's the god of the heavens. He's out there. So he's not ruling. He's not monkeying around with the little old us. He lets his children do that, because he's got other children on other planets that are ruling over there, or he's forming other galaxies far away, and he's got other business to do. I'm kind of making that up, but that's the idea.
Yeah, it seems a bit Platonic, right? That you have the monad, right, and then you have the demiurge. Maybe not necessarily.
I totally see that as a parallel. Yeah. I totally see that as a parallel. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, not necessarily like evil, but he kind of was a bit evil, wasn't he?
The demiurge, right? The demiurge is the one who created this flawed world we live in. The monad is like, he's the one who's the actual primordial source of all creation. He is like much more abstract and much more distant.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even in like Platonism, before they get he's the bad guy, the demiurge is the bad guy, that so there's the craftsman who creates everything, right? And that's like literally what demiurge means. So it's kind of interesting that there's that layer. Maybe it's, if it's...
Yeah, that's a later tradition. One of my theories is that there's a lot of stuff happening in the first millennium BC, and there's a huge shift in religions. They call it the axial age, when all of our modern religions are sort of born around the same time in the middle of the first millennium. Confucius, Buddha, Lao Tzu, which is Taoism, the Hebrew prophets, the Greek philosophers, they were all alive around the same time period in the middle of the first millennium. And all of our modern religions are all formulated around this time period. And my sense of it is, and this kind of thing I'm trying to suss out in my research, is that the older religions, the ones that are being overthrown in the Old Testament and by the Greeks, are much more nature-based and much more primitive. They're not nearly as philosophically advanced or theological. They're much more like sex makes the flowers grow. And, we're just like sun, moon, God, goddess. Like, it's very like simplistic and much more visceral, much more like grounded in much more simplistic ideas. And as things shift and they get rid of the old traditions and introduce these new traditions, you get things like wisdom. Sophia becomes wisdom, and these much more abstract ideas, much more philosophical concepts, like you see like in Plato, like Plato and Aristotle are like pretty high-minded guys. They're talking about some pretty elevated concepts that I don't think the Neolithic religions that are just really rooted in making flowers grow, I don't think that they're like, there's no evidence like from Sumer that they guys are thinking about really weighty philosophical ideas. I think it's much more, there's a primitiveness to it all. And I think that's a big part of what's happening with this. It's literally a religious reformation as they overthrow these old set of gods. The Greeks do the same thing. They talk about it in the Theogony that the Olympians had to overthrow the old Titans. Well, the Titans are the older gods. And I think the Titans are actually, my sense of it is that these are the same as the Phoenician Canaanite gods, that They were still
Oh,
worshiping
interesting. Yeah.
Kronos. They're still worshiping El, because the Greeks say El is Kronos, and I'll point that out in my slides. They explicitly say El is Kronos, and
Yeah.
so the Phoenicians were still worshiping these older set of gods, and they're still having these old sex rituals about fertility and stuff, and they get overthrown by, beginning with cultural practices, are people saying, like, you don't need to sacrifice your babies. Like, the gods aren't paying attention to these child sacrifices. You're not going to you're not going to end the drought no matter how many babies you sacrifice. You're not going to, it's not going to change whether the tide of battle. But we'll see that people did believe that kind of stuff. So you want me
Yeah.
to get into the
Yeah,
quotes here?
absolutely. And let's go right here. And before we like along those lines, we have the two creation accounts in Genesis. The the God that can speak everything into being, right, with
Yeah,
the 7 days of creation. And then we have the Lord in the garden, right, who's walking in the cool of the day. It
right.
almost seems like that's the down to earth one. And then there's the highbrow God that speaks things into being and fashions
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah,
The scholars do say that Genesis 1 highbrow God comes later than Genesis 2 with Yahweh, because Yahweh is not mentioned in the. Now it's a little bit tricky because they don't mention Yahweh in the highbrow God. Um, Nonetheless, philosophically, in terms of the substance of the ideas, Genesis 1 is a much more sophisticated depiction, philosophically, intellectually more sophisticated. And the implication is that story is written later. Um, so
um,
that kind of tricked me because of like the depiction of the women and stuff. But I'm kind of come around to the scholarly consensus that that the Genesis 1 is a later story than Genesis 2 in the Garden of Eden. But the Garden
yeah,
of Eden story is not like that story is tens of thousands of years old. Even the Garden of Eden story only goes back to like 6 or 700 BC. It's not like that old of a story. It's not Sumerian. It's not 2500 BC. It's 500 BC. Um, and the stories that they're telling in ancient Sumer of creation are of a primordial saltwater goddess, Namu, who gives birth to everything all by herself. She was sitting there all alone, and she gives birth to the other creator gods by herself, and then they in turn formulate the universe. Um, and
yeah,
so they have a totally different depiction. That's another topic, actually, is the progression of creation stories. But today I want to talk about the child sacrifice stuff, because this is actually quite grounded in evidence. Um, and so, for once, it's not just theorizing. It's like I've actually got some data here. So it's just the title, El Yahweh and Child Sacrifice. So the first couple of slides will talk about the polytheism. Scholars widely recognize that the historical Israelites were originally polytheistic and worshiped the full pantheon of Canaanite gods, for whom El was the heavenly father and creator of the universe and the father of the whole pantheon, as I was saying. And Asherah was his wife, who's the mother goddess of the pantheon. And so the original Israelites were worshiping El, and they didn't know anything about Yahweh. Yahweh comes along later. So here he says, this is the story of Jacob. Jacob is, the grandson of Abraham. And he's one of the original patriarchs, and he is the one who gets the name Israel. And this is long before they went to Egypt. It's centuries before Moses and the Exodus. So there he set up an altar and called it El Eloi Israel. And that means El is the God of Israel. And this isn't even a translation. This is actually how they write it in English text. This is like how they write it in the King James Bible. They don't even translate that into English. They leave it as El Eloi Israel. But what it means is El is the God of Israel. Israel, Beth El. And he puts this altar is in the town of Bethel. Bethel means house of El. Israel means wrestles with or contends with El. if it was Yahweh, it would be Israel or Israel or Beth Jah, but it's not. You see the name El all in these town names all over the place. You see El Shaddai, Elyon. El Shaddai means Heavenly Father or like God of Heavens. There's actually a couple different translations on El Shaddai. Elyon is Almighty God, I think. Anyway, I forget those translations. But anyway, the point is you see El all over the place without seeing Yahweh. This is from a psalm. Elohim. So sometimes you see it as Elohim. Sometimes you see it as El. Elohim is, it's important we mention this. Elohim is kind of a word that can be used in a few different ways. Sometimes it's referring to just the God El. Sometimes it's used like we use the word gods, like lowercase g and capital G. So sometimes it's just the generic God. Sometimes it's plural, so generic gods, plural. And sometimes when you read it, they're just talking about El. And scholars spend entire careers and are professional about sussing out every translation of every line about what does Elohim refer to in this particular passage versus the next particular passage. And part of it has to do with which time periods it was being written in, because as you know, most of us understand, the Torah in particular is stitched together from many different sources, from different places and different time periods. And then it all gets artfully stitched together after the whole exile, after the first temple is destroyed. They take all these different sources and put them all together into the Bible that we read. And so you've got, which is why you get all these contradictions and doublets and triplets in the same story being told multiple times with differing details, because they're taking different sources. Some are coming from Judah. Some sources are coming from Israel. Some sources are written about Yahweh. Some sources are written about El. Some sources are from the oral tradition. Some sources are just being written down. So it's all these different sources from different time periods. And I'm not enough of a scholar to do it line by line, but you can read works like by guys like Joel Baden, who do in fact go through every single line of the Torah, or even the entire. Well, it's really about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and have like separated out every single source to say that this line is from this source and the following line is from a different source, and they can suss it all out. And it's a very, it takes a professional scholar years and years and years of work to do this kind of thing. So I rely on them. I'm not doing that work. I'm reading their work. So, but this is one of the places where we're talking about El, and they're describing the Canaanite pantheon. Elohim presides in the divine assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. Now, a lot of Christian apologists will say that this is all angels and things and other kinds of divine beings. But if you go back to their time, this. But you got to remember, none of this stuff was written for us. None of this stuff was written for people thousands of years in the future. These is all written for a contemporary audience at the time that these stories are being written. And so at the time the stories are being written, we're talking about the Canaanite pantheon. And so when now other people will have a difference of opinion, but when I see this divine assembly, the way I read it is the Canaanite gods up on Mount Zaphon. The Olympians were on Mount Olympus. The Canaanite gods lived on Mount Zaphon, and which is a name that appears in the Bible. And the divine assembly is like the Olympian pantheon, but it's the Canaanite equivalent. It's the Canaanite pantheon. And so El renders judgment among the gods. He is the one that lives above them all. And when they have a dispute, they go to El to get their judgment. So Yahweh was introduced by Moses during the Exodus. He gets his name at the burning bush. That's when Yahweh is introduced to Moses. And this is from the burning bush story. It says, I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai, God Almighty, but I did not reveal my name Yahweh to them. In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob never heard of Yahweh. So even though you go back, if you look at the biblical text, you'll see Yahweh talking to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Well, that's because those texts were written later, or at least edited later. And the version we read is the version that's been filtered down through the Yahweh's biblical editors, and they interject Yahweh back into the story. they take these old stories about El and then they add a couple extra lines and say, oh, it was Yahweh too. Joel Baden goes on at length about this. Again, biblical scholarship can suss this out. Like they can see that, like, all right, you got one block of the passage here, and then Yahweh has been retrojected, edited into the story later on. And so you see that over and over and over again. And I'll get to an example of it here in a minute. But the point is, the takeaway here is that Yahweh comes along at the Exodus. That's when he appears in the story. And it's centuries after the Israelites already existed, calling themselves the followers of El. Another line also from the burning bush. Elohim also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. So again, once again, this is the other part of the story where they're making a point that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had never heard the name Yahweh. They didn't know the name Yahweh. They wouldn't have, if we went back in time, assuming there is a historical Abraham, if we were back to talk to him, he wouldn't know what you were talking about if you mentioned Yahweh. So this is from Joshua. So this is from the time after Joshua comes along, after Moses, right? It says, now fear Yahweh and serve him with all your faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. Throw away the gods, plural, that your ancestors worshipped. That's because the Israelites were polytheistic and had a lot of gods. And now you're supposed to start worshiping Yahweh, and not all of this multitude of gods you guys used to worship, like Baal and Asherah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we talk about the God of your fathers, right? And now here this seems at odds with that, right?
It sure does, because the biblical writers, on one hand, do a very artful job of stitching these texts together. It's a really quite a brilliant piece of work on one hand. But on the other hand, they get tripped up all over the place with these various contradictions. And as we'll see with the child sacrifice stuff, when you stitch El and Yahweh into a single God, these identities start to trip themselves up. And they call the gods foreign gods. You know, they really like to say, like, oh, these are Baal and Asherah were foreign gods that are getting brought into Israel. The historical reality is that Baal and Asherah were native gods to the Israelites, and that the cult of Yahweh is trying to get rid of them, which begs the question of why. Why did they want to get rid of them? What was wrong that they wanted to get rid of them? And that's what we're talking about. And one of the reasons why is because they had these ghastly, gruesome, disgusting practices, child sacrifice on one hand and crazy sex rituals on the other hand, and other stuff too. I think that's really the stuff they're fighting about but the sex stuff is with the women, and that's a different conversation. This is talking about how Yahweh is one of the many sons of El. This is from Deuteronomy. When Elion, God Most High, gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided up all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the numbers of divine sons. For Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, Israel, his allotted inheritance. So now, according to the number of divine sons. So part of Canaanite mythology is that El and Asherah have these 70 children that are the high gods. Asherah is the mother of the 70 gods. And so presumably Yahweh is one of the 70 gods. Baal is one of the 70 gods. Chemosh is one of the 70 gods. Milcom is one of the 70 gods. So each one has their own group of people. Chemosh is the god of the Moabites. You know, Baal is being worshipped up by the Phoenicians. Yahweh is the patron god of the tribes down in Judah. Here's another example of El and Yahweh being right next to each other. This is from the Psalms. For who in the skies above can compare with Yahweh? Who is like Yahweh among the heavenly beings? And in the very next line, in the council of the holy ones, El is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. Now, when this is translated to English, it says, who in the skies above can compare with the Lord? In the council of the holy ones, God is greatly feared. And so as Christians or as Jews, you don't make a distinguish between those two. You just read God and the Lord as the same God, and your brain doesn't think that these are two separate gods. But when you translate it back to the Hebrew and see Yahweh and El, and when I put El, that's because that's how the Hebrew is written. The Hebrew in this passage says El. I translated it because I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I use BibleHub.com where you can get on the computer. It's the beauty of digital scholarship. You can get the translations done for you. So when I put El in there, that's because that's how the Hebrew translates it. It translates to El. And if it translates as Elohim, I put as Elohim. And whenever it says the Lord, it's always Yahweh. So this is a passage, and I think that this is an interesting one because you could probably argue this in different ways. But to me, my reading of this is that, they're talking about Yahweh and El simultaneously, and that they're both there in the pantheon, just like in the Olympian pantheon. They got a bunch of gods all talking to one another. And so this is El and Yahweh both there. Baal would be there too, and Asherah would be there too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that with that in mind, they're asking who is comparable to Yahweh, as in he's unique, right? And then El is the mightiest, right? So El, it's not that he's the big God, but he's unique, he's distinct, right? Like, so maybe he's the God for us, he's separate from all the others.
But it says El is more awesome than all who surround him. Yahweh is a particular character here. Yahweh has special attributes, and this is being written by Yahweh, so of course they're going to favor Yahweh. But they're still identifying El as being more awesome than Yahweh, because in this time period, El and Yahweh were two separate gods. And so this must be a pretty old psalm, like this has to be dating back to, the actual first temple. Like, because some of the stuff is really quite old.
Now, just to go off on a tangent with the etymology of Yahweh, what's your take on that?
It's not something I've really studied, so I don't have like an informed opinion about it. I do think Yahweh, there does appear to be evidence that, he's from the south, he's from Midian, that he was the Shasu were these nomads from Midian that the Egyptians apparently were talking about during the second millennium. So I do think Yahweh was around. I just think he's a tribal god, and that, the context of the Exodus is the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC, so to speak. And that's when Egyptian power starts to crack up. And when they lose control of Canaan, because they'd been ruling Canaan for centuries. It was like a buffer state to keep people out of Egypt from being invaded. And so, but that starts to crack up with the Bronze Age collapse when the entire Mediterranean plunges into anarchy for a variety of reasons. And so, as a tangent, I actually think I can imagine there being some kind of exodus. It's not 600,000 fighting men. It's not, a population, with all the women and children. So it's not a population of 2 million people that a literal reading of the Exodus would have us believe, because that's like more than the entire population of Egypt and more than the entire population of Canaan. We know it wasn't that many people, but an entire town's worth of Canaanite slaves leaving Canaan leaving Egypt in the context of these dramatic, crack up of Egyptian power. I actually don't really have any problem believing that there is some original events that happened that were dramatic in their time period that then get dressed up and draped in all this mythology and legend and symbolism and turned into these very dramatic stories, turned into these supernatural stories, but that historically, some dramatic events did happen that were, dramatic to the people who took part in them. Dramatic in the sense that, like, we're slaves, but our slave masters can't keep us down now because they're preoccupied fighting a war against the sea peoples. And now is our chance to flee into the desert and escape. I don't really have a problem believing that. And then they make their way into Canaan once Egyptian power recedes even further. Like, I don't really have a problem believing that. It's obviously not the numbers that biblical writers put down. It's not, all this crazy supernatural stuff. That's obviously all myth. But like, is there a kernel of historical truth behind the myths? I don't have any problem believing that there is. And I know a lot of critical readers will say it's all a pack of lies, but I don't really see it that way. I see myths and legends built up from kernels of historical events. That's the way I read. I think it's true in the New Testament as well. I think there's a historical Jesus. I do think there was some drama surrounding the guy. And I do think that there was an organic Jesus movement that then gets co-opted by the Romans to become a Romanized Judaism. And that it's you don't need to go so far as saying the guy never existed. I think a lot of these stories, I think there's a real King David. I think there's a real King Solomon. I just don't think that the supernatural stuff happened. And I don't think King Solomon's temple was draped in gold, but I do think there was a temple there. And I do think they were worshiping Yahweh there. And I do think that there doesn't need to have ever been a united kingdom, but I do think that King David and King Solomon are, and all the kings of basically in the Book of Kings. I think basically the Book of Kings, First and Second Kings, is all historical propaganda. That every last character was a real person, even the prophets, but that it's just all completely dressed up in a propaganda telling of the story to make our side totally awesome and the other guys are totally horrible. But nonetheless, they're real people. Like Jezebel is a real person, Ahab and Omri, these kings of Israel. We know that they're real people. And part of the issue is that with the Bronze Age collapse, they go into a period of illiteracy, and there's about 300 years where there's no writing at all. And writing only kicks back in around, that we find, is like around like 850 BC. And the Hebrew language is a whole new written language. They didn't have it before. Because they used to write with cuneiform. And so cuneiform stops being used around 1200 BC. They got 300 years where there's basically no writing at all. And then around 900 BC or, thereabouts, they start having writing again. And so the whole time period when King Solomon and King David would have existed is an illiterate time period. So there's no writing, which is why we don't really have good evidence. But that doesn't mean those guys didn't exist. It just means nobody's writing anything down. So that's part of the reason why I'm sympathetic to the idea that King David actually existed. We know there was a house of David. And so it kind of follows there must have been a King David. I mean, there was somebody who was a king. I mean, King somebody was there, so anyway.
Yeah.
So now we'll get into the stuff about the actual child sacrifice. So I believe that and again, this is very controversial and people argue this in different ways, but I believe that child sacrifice was a historical reality. I missed the A. Was a historical reality among the Canaanites and Phoenicians. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just looking for the missing A, which word, but it was in Phoenician. So
child sacrifice was a historical reality. I missed got it. Yeah. I typed that up today, and obviously I wasn't being very careful.
Yep, no worries. I didn't catch it.
I didn't catch it the first time either. So this is a line that I believe is attributable to the L text. Do not hold back offerings from your granaries or your vats. You must give me the firstborn of your sons. So now this next line, this is kind of, again, will be debatable because this is written by this slide and the next are written by Eusebius, who's a Christian scholar in the 300s, 200s, 3rd century AD. So, and he is a Christian who absolutely hates the pagans and hates the Phoenicians. He's got nothing nice to say about any of them. So everything that he writes is a diatribe being critical of them. Nonetheless, and also we have almost no Phoenician mythology, because the Phoenicians at this time period were writing on papyrus and they're not writing on clay. And so none of their writings basically survive. The Greeks and Romans also didn't like them, so they were not going to go out of their way to preserve the writings of the Phoenicians. So between those variables, basically none of the Phoenician writings survive, which is a shame because the Phoenicians were an incredibly interesting people. They were really sophisticated. They were really rich. They had all these colonies all over the Mediterranean. They were the first people to sail routinely. They invented all these shipbuilding techniques. They invented all these navigation techniques. They were the first people to sail, not just around the Mediterranean, but up and down out into the Atlantic. They sailed all the way up to England and were bringing back tin from England. They circumnavigated Africa in this time period around 600 BC. So like, they were really interesting people. They had an interesting religion, which we don't know much about. They were apparently, quite into free trade. And so they would trade with, they would go to these new places and trade with the indigenous peoples. And they would they didn't just try and subjugate the indigenous peoples. They would do this fair trade stuff. They would, leave stuff on the beach and then walk away and wait for the natives to come out and put down some gold. And then the natives would leave. The natives would come up and put down some gold, what they thought was worth the fair exchange, without taking the goods. If the Phoenicians thought it was fair, they'd go up and take the gold and leave the stuff. And if the Phoenicians didn't like it, they would wait for them to come back and bring some more gold, and vice back and forth until they come to a negotiation. They wouldn't actually walk up to each other face to face because they didn't want to get in any, fighting or anything. And they didn't speak the same languages, but they had a method of having these, a fair exchange of goods. And that allowed the Phoenicians to colonize, parts of Greece, parts of Italy, the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, all the way up to Spain, Carthage and then Carthage in North Africa is their most important colony. And that becomes the big rival to the Roman Empire as Rome was coming on, before it was even the empire, when it was still the Roman Republic. They fight all these wars with the Carthaginians. It's called the Punic Wars. And there's 3 separate wars over a period of 100 or 200 years. They call them the Punic Wars. That's when Hannibal was a Carthaginian. Hannibal, he's got the name Baal in his name. So the Carthaginians are Baal worshippers. And you see Baal in their names, like Hannibal, all over the place. And they worship El and Baal. And they did all this child sacrifice. And so in this thing, though, from Eusebius, he's recounting some third-hand Phoenician mythology. And I include this not because it's necessarily reliable, but because the one story he does include is the story of El sacrificing his own child. And I'll get that in the second slide. But I'll just read this and you can judge it for yourself. Of the mystical sacrifice of the Phoenicians. Excuse me. It was a custom among the ancients in times of great calamity, in order to prevent the ruin of all, for the rulers of the city or nation to sacrifice to the avenging deities the most beloved of their children as the price of redemption. And those who were thus given up were sacrificed with mystic rites. Now, again, he's being critical of this. He thinks this is disgusting, but nonetheless, he's talking about it. Kronos, then, so same as the Greek Kronos, whom the Phoenicians call El. So again, we're at the very explicit correlation between El and Kronos, whom the Phoenicians call El, who was the king of the country, had by a nymph of the country named Enobret an only begotten son, whom they on this account called Iud. I don't know how you pronounce that, Iud. And when very great dangers from war had beset the country, he arrayed his son in royal apparel, prepared an altar, and sacrificed him. So I include this story simply because it's a story where El is sacrificing his own child, and it's speaking to these traditions. And this is just one of many. This will be the latest time period wise. This will be the latest one I have. Everything else comes much earlier.
Yeah. Now, you almost have to think about about Christ being sacrificed with this. That is that an imitation of this story?
Almost certainly. I mean, it's just such a trope that um, that's been going on for a long time. I mean, Christianity is just steeped in
Mhm.
symbolism and imagery that are pagan. The Virgin Mother of God, that God sacrificing His Son. Um, so many. Like that's a whole nother conversation. And like I know
Um,
people love to talk about this stuff about, and I love the Christian apologists are like loath to admit any of it. They're like, how can you possibly say there's any paganism at all? And then like you just look at the symbols and the stories and like
mhm.
it's all, the water into wine is like an exact recreation of a Dionysus story and all these things,
Yeah.
so um
Yeah. There was a recent apologist who claimed that child sacrifice was a fringe idea. Um,
I don't know how common it was. Um,
well, it's the scholarly consensus. I hear that it was a real thing.
at least in some places, at least
Yeah.
in some communities. And that's when I say I don't know how widespread. I don't know that every community did child sacrifice. I imagine it's the kind of thing that was debated. That like it's like slavery. I always like this stuff to slavery in America. It's like not all of America had slavery. They only had slavery in the South. In the North, they thought slavery was horrible from the 1600s. They didn't want slavery at all. There's a reason why slavery only took hold in the North, aside from the economic factors. I mean, the South had the agriculture that needed slaves. But in the North, they were also just morally opposed to it from the first days, from the early
Yeah.
1600s. They didn't want slavery in Massachusetts. They didn't want slavery in Pennsylvania from the days that they founded those colonies. And so it got pushed down to Virginia.
You
Um,
wonder why, like why the moral difference? Like why, what is it about the North that would do that? I mean, I know this is a tangent, but I've always wondered that.
it's a
Um,
fair question. And I mean, it's mostly driven by economics. I mean, they just weren't running these kinds of plantations in the North that, required that. I mean, they're industrialized in the North. And so they lean into, I mean, I'm a firm opinion that slavery only really ended because of the Industrial Revolution. And that if we didn't have the Industrial Revolution, we would still have slavery. Um, and I'm not really convinced it was ever, I think there was, I think going back to the first days of slavery 5,000 years ago, there was plenty of people that didn't like it, especially the slaves. Um, and so slavery is primarily an economic phenomenon. It's primarily an exploitive phenomenon. And so if whatever business you're in doesn't require exploitive labor, then you don't need to enslave anyone. And it's easier for you to take the moral high horse and say, I don't enslave people. And if you're in the kind of business, namely commercial agriculture, that requires, high body counts of labor, then you're going to be more reliant on slavery. Same with fossil fuels. It's like, it's easy if you're not in the kind of business that requires big machines to like poo poo the use of fossil fuels. But if you're in the airliner business, or if you're in the mining business, or if you're in a business that runs great big huge machines, you're going to be using your diesel fuel. Like the military does not poo poo fossil fuels because the military uses, a river's worth on a daily basis to keep all the airplanes in the air and to keep the tanks running. And, you know, it's gallons per mile of fuel for a tank. So the military is not going to sit there and get on some moral high horse about the use of fossil fuels. I think the same thing with slavery. I think that some people need it, so to speak. At least they feel that they need it for the economic reasons, and some people don't. And so, I'm sure there was differences of opinion about slavery all the way through history. I mean, I'm pretty
um,
sure of it, frankly. Um, and so, and I'm sure, and I'm quite certain there was difference of opinion about child sacrifice. that there was, and that And that I give a lot of credit to the Hebrew prophets and to the followers of Yahweh that like they were genuinely opposed to it. I think they were totally 100% totally opposed to it. And that this is a dispute that they're having in the streets between the Baalists and the Yahwists. And that's my whole argument of this entire lecture. This is a very interesting slide right here because this is from the Bible. This is a story from Kings that of a battle between Moab and Judah that the archaeologists have actually found a stele. They call it the Mesha stele that was written by the Moabites talking about this actual battle. And this is 840 BC. And this is what I'm talking about. This is when the writing starts to come back in. Middle of 9th centuries when we start to see writing again. And we can start to say, wow, this Bible story correlates to this precise event because we've got an actual written record of it. And this is a written record by the Moabites. Now, in the Bible story, well, I'll just read it first. When the king of Moab saw the battle had gone against him, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through to the king of Edom, but they failed. Then he took his firstborn son, who was to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. The fury against Israel was great, and they withdrew and returned to their own land. So this is a story where the child sacrifice worked. It worked. The king of Moab sacrificed the prince, and that, in their opinion, turned the tide of the battle. And the fact that we've got this stele that shows that this battle actually had, now the stele does not mention anything about a sacrifice, but it does talk about how they defeated Judah. I do believe that this stele is also the first one that actually has a mention of Yahweh in the archaeological record, that there is actually no, well, there's that stuff from Egypt about the Shasu, but that's a little bit more ambiguous. But this is like, they talk about Yahweh and how they defeated the Judeans, the Judahites. And so this battle actually happened around 840 BC. And as far as they can tell in the story, the child sacrifice really appeared to have worked. I think that's really remarkable, frankly.
Yeah.
All right, so now we're going to get into the Abraham and Isaac story. And I want you to pay attention to this little bit of detail because I hear people talking about this and they generally overlook it because since Yahweh and El are conflated in most people's minds, they don't see the distinguishing. They see that they read the story and they think that Yahweh is demanding the sacrifice. But when you read the story closely, look what it says. When they arrived at the place Elohim had designated, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar atop the wood. Now, I don't have all of the whole story in the slides, but the entire story up to here, it's just El. It's just Elohim. It's always Elohim who demands the sacrifice. And Yahweh does not appear in the story. Yahweh does not appear in the story until the next line. That's Genesis 22:9. And now I'm going to go to Genesis 22:11, 2 verses later. But the angel of Yahweh called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear Elohim because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. It's Yahweh that provides the deliverance. Elohim demands the sacrifice, but Yahweh provides the deliverance. My opinion that this is a story written by the Yahwehs, taken an older story. There's some rabbinical scholarship that's very old, rabbinical stories from like the 1st and 2nd century AD, where they apparently believe that Isaac did die. In some of the rabbinical tellings of the story, they really did believe that Isaac died and was reborn in a different supernatural way. But what I'm reading here is that Elohim is demanding the sacrifice and Yahweh is providing the deliverance. And that will speak to what we're going to see later with Jeremiah when Yahweh says, it never crossed my mind to demand a sacrifice.
And you wonder with Isaac and Jacob, right? Is that the story? Yeah, with so Isaac and his brother What's Isaac's brother's name?
Or you mean Jacob and Esau?
Oh, I'm conflating the stories. Got it. Okay.
I don't think Isaac has a brother.
Right.
Jacob has a brother. Oh no, Abraham has a brother, which is uh, um, who's the firstborn before Isaac, who's the son of the slave, which his name is shit. What's his name?
Well,
And that's the one the
let's see.
Muslims trace their hair.
Probably
The son of Hagar, of the slave Hagar. She's not the son of Sarah. He's the son of Hagar, and he's the one that the Muslims trace their heritage back to. But he doesn't get sacrificed. They just kick him out. And that's a whole other thing with the marriages and the matriarchal marriages and stuff that I talk about in other places. But there's no sacrifice in that part of the story.
got it.
So I think Yahweh provides the deliverance. Yahweh, the cult of Yahweh is opposed to sacrifices. This is
Ishmael.
Ishmael, yes, that was yeah, Ishmael, exactly. So this or I'll just read this first. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to what is usually translated as Moloch. Do not give your children to be sacrificed to Moloch, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. I am Yahweh. So this is the laws of Leviticus. Now, modern day scholars think that the Moloch is a mistranslation. And because there is no god Moloch in any of the other neighboring cultures, no one's ever found a god Moloch anywhere. They find the god Chemosh. They find the god Milcom, which is a different god. They find Asherah and Baal. Those gods are all well attested. But Moloch is not mentioned anywhere. But in the Phoenician writings that they have from Carthage, those infant sacrifices are called a mulk. So Hebrew has no vowels. The original versions of Hebrew has no vowels. And so all the vowels were put in later. So the original word is just MLK. And obviously when you put in the vowels, you can have dramatically different words that you can come up with. And so you get a lot of mistranslations this way. And this is something that modern scholars spend a lot of time going through the original Hebrew to suss out, where words may have been mistranslated along the way. And so one of the main ones is this thing about Moloch or Mulk. And they believe, the modern scholarship attests, that it's a Mulk sacrifice. And that's just simply the name for this type of sacrifice. Like, it's a technical name. It's not a sacrifice to a god named Moloch. It's just, if you're going to do these Mulk sacrifices, these sacrifices where you sacrifice an infant, there's different contexts also for child sacrifice. Sometimes it's in a time of calamity, like we were describing with that battle, and that was like a grown son. But what the Carthaginians did a lot of was sacrificing babies during perfectly good times, not during bad times, but just during normal times, because they're looking for favors from the gods. And they called it a Mulk sacrifice. And so this shows up. So there's no god Moloch, is what the modern scholars all think. And so here it is again. This is a law of Yahweh saying, don't do this. And the Leviticus stuff is written later. That's the priestly writer, and that's one of the later stuff compared to of all the stuff in the Torah. Leviticus was probably written last. This is Jeremiah, as I was mentioning. He is quite possibly a real person who witnessed, he's there at the end. He witnesses, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. He says, they have built high places of Baal to burn their children in fires, offerings to Baal, something I did not command or mention, nor did it enter my mind. And so he's speaking for Yahweh when he says, I did not mention it, or did it offer, nor did it enter my mind. And this is where we're seeing, Baal and El, it's where Baal is the local king of the gods that they're doing this. And this tracks with the Phoenicians. Again, more Jeremiah. This kind of says the same thing. They built high places for Baal in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice their sons and daughters to Moloch. though I never commanded it, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such a detestable thing and so make Judah sin. All right, now we're going to get into some of the Greek writings. This is Clitarchus from 300 BC, and he's talking about the Phoenicians. He's talking about the Carthaginians. So, out of reverence for Kronos, who we already established is El, out of reverence for Kronos, the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity, if they are especially eager to gain success. There stands in their midst a bronze statue of Kronos, its hands extended over a bronze brazier, the flames of which engulf the child. When the flames fall upon the body, the limbs contract and the open mouth seems almost to be laughing, until the contracted body slips quietly into the brazier. Thus it is the grin is known as sardonic laughter, since they die laughing. And this is like how the biblical stories are always depicted, with like, this this big god, fiery, bronze statue with the fire and his arms extended. They put the baby in the fire. It's quite gruesome. It's quite it's a pretty gruesome tradition. I can only laugh because otherwise I'd cry. But again, it comes back to, people will be critical of this because they're saying this is just the Greeks and they hate the Carthaginians, or maybe Clitarchus maybe is Roman. But either way, this is just diatribes written by their enemies to just slander them. But I don't know. I don't really think so. I'm inclined to believe that this is what people said. And so there's some more here. This will be by Plutarch in the 1st century. With full knowledge and understanding, they themselves offered up their own children, and those who had no children would buy little ones from poor people and cut their throats as if they were so many lambs or young birds. Meanwhile, the mother stood by without a tear or a moan, but should she utter a single moan or let fall a single tear, she had to forfeit the money, and her child was sacrificed nevertheless. And the whole area before the statue was filled with a loud noise of flutes and drums, so that the cries of wailing should not reach the ears of the people. Again, it's like the idea that they're not even going to sacrifice their own babies, but buy some children from the poor. That also adds to just the gruesomeness of it all. This is an era of high infant mortality. So a woman might get pregnant 6 or 8 times in her life and only have, 2 or 3 children go to adulthood. So, lots of babies died young. And so it's, there's a different cultural context to some of this stuff. But anyway, it's pretty gruesome description here. And even if they're exaggerating it, and they're just speaking to stereotypes, there would still have to be some kernel of truth behind it, because stereotypes exist for a reason. They exist even when they're insulting stereotypes. There's always some measure of reality behind them. Otherwise, the stereotypes don't stick. Nobody believes them. If it's like, if you describe Mexicans as a bunch of sushi eaters, people be like, "What are you talking about? Mexicans don't eat sushi." It's like, you got to have, if you want to be insulting and you want your insult to like strike a nerve, there's got to be some kernel to it, like some kernel of truth to it. Otherwise, people are just like, "What are you talking about?" This one is from this is Roman, Diodorus Siculus. I'm not sure what the time period is, but it's a Roman. And obviously, again, they hated the Carthaginians, but this is what they talk about. Therefore, the Carthaginians, believing that the misfortune... Oh, no, what he's talking about here, he's recounting a war that between Syracuse and Carthage. And Syracuse was a Greek city-state around 300 BC. And I think it's referring to the same events that were in the previous slide. Therefore, the Carthaginians, believing that misfortune had come to them from the gods, betook themselves to every manner of supplication of divine powers. They also alleged that Kronos had turned against them, inasmuch as in former times they had been accustomed to sacrifice to this god the noblest of their sons, but more recently, secretly buying and nurturing children that they had sent these to the sacrifice. And when an investigation was made, some of those who'd been sacrificed were discovered to have been supposititious. When they had given thought to these things and saw their enemy encamped before their walls, they were filled with superstitious dread, for they believed that they had neglected the honors of the gods that had been established by their fathers. In their zeal to make amends for their omission, they selected 200 of the noblest children and sacrificed them publicly, and others who were under suspicion and sacrificed themselves voluntarily, in numbers not less than 300. There was in their city a bronze image of Kronos, extending its hands, palms up and sloping toward the ground, so that each of the children, when placed thereon, rolled down and fell into a sort of pit, gaping pit filled with fire. So again, it's just another source talking about, describing it in the same kind of way, with this bronze statue of Kronos and this hot fire, and they kill the baby and put him in the fire, and then they would collect the ashes and put them in an urn and bury them in a tophet. And they talk about tophets are the ritual burials, and they talk about them in the Bible. And they found one. They found them in Carthage. They found a great big one in Carthage, and they found smaller ones at other Phoenician sites, and I think one in Sicily. And they dug it up, and the archaeologists have pulled up these urns and found the bones of children in these urns, and also bones of animals. They would sacrifice animals too. But this is not a regular burial ground. It's not a burial ground for like a normal cemetery for adults. And again, the archaeology gets tricky because children's bones are soft, so they don't survive that well. And so it's hard to know. And, it gets it's complicated and it's subtle. And so if you want to be an apologist for the Carthaginians, which there are people that are out there that are scholars who will defend to high heaven that the Carthaginians never did this stuff, and that this is all just a bunch of slander written by their enemies. I frankly am not convinced by their claims. I think that these stories are legit because I think the Greeks and Romans and the Hebrews are all describing the same thing, and they were all equally disgusted by it. All right, so this is back to Jeremiah. They have built the high places of the Tophet, in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, something I did not command, nor did it enter my mind. So now this is my last slide. This is about King Josiah. Now Josiah is later in the game. He's a contemporary of Jeremiah, and he was one of the great reformers of Yahweh who tries to put an end to these practices. And as far as we know, Josiah is a real person. So he's talking about Josiah here. He also desecrated the Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one could sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Moloch, to the Moloch sacrifice. So this is from the Bible, and so they ripped up the Tophets, and that may be why we never found one. They never found any Tophets in Israel or anywhere around Israel. So this is why, again, it gets controversial, because if you're going to be a minimalist and say, I'm only going to commit to things for which we find explicit archaeological evidence, then you're going to say, oh, we don't think they were doing it. I'm not a minimalist. I think that you can't just only go with the archaeology, because the archaeology is obviously very incomplete. I'm more of a mosaic person. I take all the available stuff, put it all together, and see what picture emerges. And to my mind, it's pretty clear that the Baalists are doing these sacrifices. They're making the sacrifices to El, and that the Yahwists are reformers. This is why they hate the Baalists and why they have this big dispute that plays out over centuries. And that later biblical writers, when they conflate El and Yahweh into be one monotheistic God of the Bible, that it becomes very confusing to the writer. That this is one of the places where the biblical writers get tripped up, because it looks like the God of the Bible is simultaneously demanding sacrifices and saying not to do them at the same time. And this has long been a source of confusion for biblical readers. And I think it's a function of that they were originally two separate gods, and that there was a reformation over cultural practices, and that and the Yahwehs were genuine. They were the progressive social reformers of the day, the social justice warriors of their era, who wanted to put an end to these grotesque and disgusting and contemptible practices. Um, and so that's the end of all my slides. And so we can just talk. But yeah, I'm pretty sympathetic to the Hebrew prophets in this regard.
Yeah, that is wild. I couldn't imagine that taking place. And
Well, people haven't stopped killing babies, frankly. We left babies out to exposure, unwanted children out to exposure, right up into modern times. And people only stopped doing that when they invented surgical abortions. And now we have surgical abortions. Now it's obviously not ritualized. We don't have an abortion and make it out to be an offering to the gods. Please, God, let me win the lottery and I'll give you my baby. But in the era, this is what I'm talking about. The older religions pre-axial age were much more primitive and superstitious by our standards, and much more visceral, much more like, much more rooted in these sort of, if I sacrifice something of value, that'll change the weather. We don't believe that anymore. We don't believe that, because we have much more sophisticated understanding of how the world works. We don't think that sacrificing anything is going to change the weather or bring about the rains or bring about good fortune. And we certainly don't sacrifice our children, but I have no problem believing that these more primitive people, that they did, because there's a logic to it. There's a total logic to it, that if you really want the gods to win the favor of the gods, if you actually think that sacrificing animals or vegetables, the idea is the more valuable the sacrifice, the more the gods are going to listen to you. And there's nothing more important than your own children. And for the entire community, there's nothing more important than the prince. And so the most valuable sacrifice from the perspective of the entire community is to sacrifice the royal prince. And that's what you see in with that story of Moab, because the entire town is about to be destroyed. Like the Israelites are about to lay waste the entire town and kill everybody inside the town. So a sacrifice of the royal prince, if that's going to work, that's a good bargain. It's a good bargain for the king. It's a good bargain for the town. And if you believe that this stuff works, then the prince himself is probably going to be willing to do it, because it's noble. It's a noble gesture on his part. We see it, and I don't have this in my slides, but the Greek story of Iphigenia, which is about, from the Iliad, which is Agamemnon's daughter prior to leaving for the Trojan War. He had assembled this entire armada, and they're all ready to go attack Troy, but Agamemnon has angered the gods, and so the goddess Artemis, and so she has calmed the winds, and so the ships can't set sail. And so Agamemnon brings his daughter Iphigenia there and sacrifices her, and that pleases Artemis, and they are able to set sail. And this is an important story in Greek mythology, because it sets up a later set of stories where Agamemnon's wife and Iphigenia's mother is pretty damn upset about it. And when Agamemnon comes back, that's Clytemnestra is her name. And when Agamemnon comes back from the Trojan War, she kills him in revenge for him killing their daughter. And so, and I think it's, again, a parallel that the Greeks also saw this in their more ancient history, and the Olympians were also a parallel culture to the Hebrews, and they're totally contemporary, and they are also going through this contemporary cultural shift, shedding these older traditions and bringing forth a newer set of more sophisticated intellectual traditions. And so they don't like child sacrifice either, but they recognize that it used to exist.
Yeah, and there's also Jephthah, right? And his daughter.
Yep, there's that one too. And I didn't include that in this story, but again, it's another indication that it was normative to like sacrifice your baby. You know, in an era of like high infant mortality, when even adults didn't really live past the age of 40, to get to the age of 50 would be like a really old man. And, you know, 3/4 of your children aren't going to make it to adolescence. It's just a different, such a wildly different cultural context. But we also look at it as primitive and superstitious and futile, and ignorant. And I don't think anyone would look back on any of this stuff as anything other than, you know, horrible. But I do think it's a historical reality. And I do think that, you know, humans are capable of doing all sorts of ghastly things, and we always have been. And so, yeah, I think it was historical reality. I really do.
So, do we want to answer some questions and comments?
Yeah, if you got some folks there. Yeah, if you got some questions, let's have at it.
All right, wonderful. So here we'll start with Evil Fandango. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you.
Interesting presentation. All right, and here, let's see. Oh yeah, we have a whole bunch of comments. All right, and so we'll go to Stinky Paradox. Thank you. Let's see. What about the parallels between Psalm 104 and the hymn to the Aten? If derivative, it would make it about 600 years older. I'm not familiar. Yeah. So yeah.
Aten being the Egyptian monotheistic god from the 1300s BC. I think that's who he's referring to. I haven't studied Aten at any great length. I'm aware of the probable influence on the advancement of monotheism, but I really don't think that the first temple is monotheistic. Though I do think they clearly have a lot of influence from Egypt, and so there's, you know, there's loads of influence from Egypt. So, but I can't comment on Psalm 104 or the hymn Aten. I'm not familiar with either one.
Yeah, for sure. And so, yeah, if you know, you want to clarify that, Stinky Paradox, we can show that. And then I've come to believe that the Elohim pantheon and Yahweh are syncretized to the Roman Greco pantheon. Yahweh is.
Yeah. No, I basically agree with this. During the time period, during the first temple, when they were polytheistic, Baal equaled Zeus. The Greeks would have correlated Zeus to Baal. And I think that the Yahwehs are trying to knock Baal off the king of the hill and become the new king of the hill. And so the Yahwehs they take on the titles, rider on the clouds, Lord. Baal meant Lord. So you would use that in common everyday speech. My Baali is something you would say, that's how you would say my Lord. So when Yahweh becomes the Lord, that is something they explicitly took from Baal, because Baal meant Lord before Yahweh meant Lord. And so to the extent that you can correlate Zeus to Baal, which since they were contemporary, at the time they were contemporary, they would have, and to the extent that Yahweh, for at least a brief window of time, get my hand in the camera here, for a brief window of time, when Yahweh was part of this polytheistic pantheon and he's trying to take over Baal's titles, like Rider on the Cloud and Lord, at that particular moment, yeah, Yahweh would have correlated to Zeus. But obviously it goes in a different direction a couple of centuries later. And then that correlation doesn't really hold up later on.
Yeah. I've not seen that spelling of Jove there, Jove. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, I think, like I'm not a Latin scholar, but I think maybe I've seen that before.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Dan's Macabre. And we have
You lost it. It was up on the screen for a moment.
Okay, here we got it. There we go. We got it. All right. Oh, here I just switched. There we go. All right.
Oh,
I mean, not that it matters, but let's see who's on what side. But does Mr. Dodge regard El as a sun deity, as translated to Helios, just as An is? What celestial body does Yahweh represent? Obviously, his name is referred to as the Tetragrammaton, I assume Polaris.
yeah. So El and Kronos were Saturn, and when they're talking about the planets. So Zeus and Baal and Marduk, they're all Jupiter. Um, and Zeus becomes Jupiter. It's explicitly called Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. And El and Kronos were Saturn. That one, the quote I had from Eusebius, that is part of a longer text, and they talk about El being Saturn in that text. Um, Now, the creator god being the sun god, that's Egyptian. This is a distinction between Egyptian mythology and Mesopotamian mythology, because in Mesopotamian mythology, the sun god is an important god, but he's not the creator god. That would be Shamash, and then he's got another name. He's the brother of Ishtar. He's the sun god. He's not the creator god. Now, in Egyptian mythology, the creator god is Ra, and he is the sun god. And so um, it's only later on, after Alexander the Great, that you really see the Greek and Egyptian pantheons get totally syncretized together. And then that's when you see, and again, with the moon being the mother goddess, that's Egyptian. Same idea. In the Mesopotamians, the moon is actually not even a woman. The moon is a male god, and he's an important god. He's one of the main, the big seven, but he's not he's not a mother goddess. That is an Egyptian idea. And that actually idea becomes popular in the Greek and Roman era and persists into the Middle Ages. And we would still correlate the moon to a feminine deity to this very day. And I think in no small part because of the correlation between women's menstrual cycles and the moon, it makes sense to correlate the moon with the woman and the sun god to the male patriarchal father figure. But that is definitely an Egyptian idea and is not Sumerian. So like Sumerian, Babylonian, Canaanites are already starting to mix Egyptian ideas in, but and then Olympian is all a very clear correlation and a very clear continuum where they really are taking the same pantheon and just changing the names. And it's a pretty similar, like for the Greeks, Apollo is the sun god. He's not the creator god. And Apollo, well, also like Helios is the sun and Apollo is sometimes the sun god. So there's also a lot of inconsistency in all these things because there's no central doctrine and dogma. So every community is free to change things around a little bit. But in the Greeks, they don't correlate the sun with the creation of the universe. That is definitely an Egyptian idea. And then when you start to see that become really popular, like in the Roman era, that's because they've incorporated the Egyptian gods, and the Egyptian gods are very popular in the Roman era. And so you see the sun god sort of become very popular in Roman times. And so by the time you get to Constantine, who's like the first Christian emperor, he was worshiping the sun god before he became a Christian. That is an Egyptian and Roman context and not a Sumerian, Babylonian concept.
Yeah. Very good. And so here we got Dan's Macabre comment. That's exactly what, let's see, I believe also Elios Helios. Yeah. Yeah. And then we have Dan's Macabre again. Yahweh would be the older black sun. I'm
See, the
not.
Yahwist, they really didn't like the Yahwists are very clear. They don't like the worshiping the suns and the stars. They make kind of a big deal about this in their reforms. It really pisses them off when like who is it? King Ahaz builds a temple, builds an altar to the Assyrian god Ashur in the temple of Yahweh, and he brings in all the suns and stars. That really pisses off the Yahwists. They don't like that stuff at all. So I don't really think Yahweh is ever really explicitly correlated to a heavenly body because that just wasn't their style. Um, you might find some sort of peripheral examples of it on the side, but it was never a main thrust. In the Bible, they make it really clear. They don't like the suns and the stars, and they don't like astronomy really. Like it's not an astronomical religion. Judaism is not an astronomical religion. Um, this is something that where they are. This is one of those cultural traditions where they are distinguishing themselves from all their pagan neighbors. Um, so I a little bit disagree on the correlation of Yahweh with any heavenly body. I don't really think that they were doing that. I really think that they actually kind of were explicitly opposed to it. Same thing with like idolatry and like having a statue of the gods and putting clothes on it and giving it food and changing its clothes every day. They didn't like that stuff either. This is again, there's numerous things that they're having reforms about, and those are that's another one of them. And again, in the early days of Yahweh, it's hard to say because we don't have writing and there's very little evidence, so we're really speculating. But by the time you get to the exile, and by the time you get to them formulating the Torah, they make it abundantly clear they do not like idolatry, they do not like astronomy, they don't like sex rituals, and they sure as hell don't like child sacrifice. So, um, even though the Carthaginians were still doing it, um, by the time you get to the Second Temple, they are like 110% opposed to it and think it's one of those long list of things that they think their pagan neighbors are disgusting about.
Yeah, and originally, like when I first read this comment, the black sun is Saturn. I remember hearing the belief that Saturn used to be the sun. So I mean, that's kind of along the same ideas as the old pantheon and the new pantheon, right? So I forget which tradition that is, but they hold that the planet Saturn used to be
It
the sun.
was once a sun. Okay, I'm not familiar with that concept.
And here we'll go again with Dan's Macabre. So this is interesting. The slaughter of the innocents. Do you think that might have to do with anything about killing the firstborns of the Egyptians? Maybe so they would have
Well, it's a
no.
little bit different to kill the firstborn of like the underclass, or of like Herod killing. There's probably some parallels. I mean, um, yeah, like or just killing the firstborn of the flock, of a flock of lambs or what have you. Um, there is a lot of, and I think you can probably formulate it in different ways in different contexts, but there's a lot of occult, mystical power in that type of blood sacrifice that can be used in different ways for good or for ill, and that blood sacrifice is a powerful ritual, whether you believe in it or not. Some people believe in it, but there's no question that people did a lot of it and have done a lot of it over the centuries. And the firstborn always has the greatest power of a blood sacrifice. A firstborn is always going to be more powerful than a latter born. And then and so yeah, if there's like a group like Herod, or if you're afraid, there's a group you're afraid of, like Pharaoh with the Exodus, go around killing all the firstborn of this group you're afraid might rise up against you. If nothing else, it's a show of force, right? It's a show of your power against them, that they can't stop you from coming in and taking your firstborn son and killing him. Like, there's a ritualistic spiritual power to it, but there's also just this raw show of force power. So yeah, I'm sure there's probably a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I've never, yeah, I mean, the whole idea of human sacrifice, I didn't know was so prevalent, right? But yeah, and then we can kind of see parallels where we don't really see parallels. Let's see. Oh,
I don't know what that is. The Mazareth. I don't know what that is.
yeah, neither do I. I'm trying to get that on the screen. Yeah, I don't.
Oh, hey, there's.
Oops. There we are. Yeah, I don't know either. So maybe let's see if we have any more questions. We can ask questions, or if there's other comments, we can do that before we head out. If anybody has a burning question.
Yeah, it's been an hour and a half, so it's probably a good time to get to
yeah, sure.
wrap it up here.
Yeah, but yeah, that is crazy. I mean, just what I guess superstition, but they didn't think of it as a superstition. Just how crazy that could be. I guess the moral of the story is to take your religion with a grain of salt, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but yeah, here maybe we'll leave it there. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not seeing any new comments or questions. So yeah, so thank you so much. That is that's crazy. It like, and I mean it's sad that that was a thing. I'm glad the Yowists won, right? Just like with slavery, we're glad the Yankees won.
That's right.
But yeah. So let's see. Any final thoughts before we head out, or is that probably a good place to leave, right?
No, I think it's been great. I really appreciate the conversation. It's always fun to talk to you. And so yeah, and like, if there's one thing I'd like to, get, if anyone wants to like have this, extend this conversation offline, is just this notion that the fight between Yahweh and Baal has like these cultural content. It's not just some esoteric philosophical dispute or my God versus your God. That they're actually fighting over something very practical and very, very real world on the ground stuff. And that you can imagine folks having an argument in the streets, for and against. One side is saying, we've been doing this for centuries, our fathers and our grandfathers, and how dare you tell us to stop? And the other side is saying, you ignorant fools, like, cut it out. Stop doing all this horrible stuff you're doing. And that it's not a fight that resolves itself in anyone, doesn't resolve itself in a single generation or even in a single century, that they fought about it for a long time. And you can see parallels in the modern world where we fight about stuff for a long time. They fought about slavery for centuries in America before the Civil War. They'd been fighting about it for over 100 years. We've been fighting about racism. We're still fighting about racism, so like old habits die hard, and deeply held beliefs die even harder. And so it's, I really believe that, and the same thing goes true with the fighting with the goddesses about Asherah, that there's a lot of like on the ground cultural traditions that they were fighting about. And the philosophical ideas come later as a justification for, really trying to change people's behavior first. So that comes first. The philosophy comes second.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at history. But yeah. All right. So yeah, thank you for coming. It was very enlightening. And thank you everybody for watching. And have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thanks.